Hi, welcome back. In today's video, let's create an API specifications in RAML. We'll take an example of the REST API and we'll clearly describe the details of the API. For example, the resource details, on which resource the user is acting upon. For example, it can be flights, user, or employees, or it can be anything. And the details of the method. For example, the get HTTP method. And we'll define the details of the query parameters, header parameters, so on. And also in the responses, what a user can expect in case of success, and also what they can expect as a response for negative workflows. And also we'll clearly say what media types our API supports. So let's take an example of the REST API. So this is the API that we have seen in the previous sessions as well. It's a get flights API. So user will get the flight information from this API. So there are a list of query parameters, the origin and destination, and the departure date details, and also the flight class. So user can call this API and get the flight information and also the booking information. And we also have the header parameters, client ID and secret, or header parameters. So these are the details needed for the get flights API. There is a post flights API as well. Here users should give the flight information in the request body. So this is a flight information. So when the user calls this API, the flight information will be written to the database, for example. So these are the two APIs that we have. Today we'll go and create API specification for this from Design Center. Let's go and log into any point Mulesoft. Yes, click on sign in. This is a home page of any point Mulesoft. We can see the options available, the different tools. Let's click on Design Center. This is the home page where we can see the project that we have created. Click on new, create new. From here we can create a new API specifications. We can create the API specification in two ways. We can create and write a code on our own using RAML or Open API specifications, or we can use a visual interface for creating the API specifications. So let's name it Flight Experience API. Yes, let's click on create API. This will create the new project called Flight Experience API. This is a API designer. This page we can see the editor, and also left side the files explorer, and also the right side we can see the documentation sections. And also below we have a shell where the details are auto populated. And also exchange.json will give the will show the metadata of the project, what dependencies, the name of the project, so on. So let's go to editor, and here based on where we place the cursor we get the auto populated parameters below. We can see that the below in the shell we can see the available options. We can select based on our requirement. We have the documentation details, description, documentation, so on. Let's select the description and we'll describe the project. This project gives the APIs for flight information, for example. Enter. Let's come down. Let's start with the get flights API now. Flights is a resource. Let's start with the resource slash and the name of the resource colon. The right side in the document section we can see that the endpoint is created for flights. We have to use the slash and the name of the resource. If we don't have slash, it gives an error. Yeah, now the flights endpoint is getting created. Now we have to use a method. It's a get API, so let's use a get method. Now we can see that the get API is created. Let's give the description. It gets the flight information, array of flights. Enter. Based on where you have placed the cursor, you will get the option. We have a list of query parameters. Let's start defining the query parameters. And before that, let's see, if we come exactly below the get, we will get the option of other HTTP methods. Let's select that. We can see in the documentation that there are two APIs created now, get and post. And next, if you want to define the URI parameter, you can use slash, the curly braces, and then the ID is the URI parameter. So based on where you have the cursor, you will get the auto-populated options. You can take help from that and select based on your requirements. So let's continue with query parameters. Select query parameters. Let's add all the query parameters that have from, and this accept strings. So the type of the field is string. And example, you can give, since it's a string, you can give the example something in string. Let's take some city name. If we don't give the space between key and value, you will get an error. So space is a must. So we should, to define the next parameter, we should be exactly below the first parameter. Destination. Again, this is a string field. Let's give an example for the destination as well. You can use any city you want. If you click on the endpoint, the get endpoint, you can see the details of the parameters that we have defined in the editor. So the documentation is auto-populated. Let's copy the departure date. It's again a string field. And the example for the departure date is, let's copy from the Postman. Based on your requirement, you can choose the data type, and also it can be enum or any other type. Based on your requirement, you can specify. Let's consider this flight class field is a enum, and it supports economy. And first class, user cannot give any other values, any other string other than these specified enums. Premium. Yeah, we can see that the departure date, flight class are auto-populated in the documentation sections. Example, let's give an example data. Let's add premium. Yeah, we can see the example. If you give something else, you will get an error. In the error, we can clearly see that the value should be one of the allowed values. As this field is a enum, this has got the limitation. The supplied value should be one among these. So the API consumer can look into this, the API specification can understand what exactly they have to pass in order to access these APIs. So now let's start with header parameters. We have to go exactly below the query parameters, and here the below we can see the auto populated components. Let's select header. Client ID, the name of the header is client ID and the type is again string. Example, this client ID and secret, these we will pass when we set the client ID enforcement policy. So that we will see in future session. That time any API consumer should get the access for this particular API. So when they request for access, they'll get the client ID and secret, so that they can pass these details. Then they will be able to access our APIs. So for now, let's define the header parameters. The both are string fields. So yeah, we got the header parameters. Yes, the parameters are done, and now it's time for response. Let's define the details of the response. In case of 200, we will get the array of flights from this API. So if you're somewhere, we should be exactly below the header and query parameters, otherwise we don't get the responses option. Now we can see that the response is available because we are exactly below that header and query params. We have the option for response codes. Let's select 200. We get a response body and the type is JSON. We are getting the JSON response from the API. And we'll give the description of the response. What response we get? We get the array of flights. And let's give the example. Let's copy this response and paste it here. Let's change the alignment tab. Okay, select whatever we want to move, then tab. Yes, now it's aligned. We have created the get flights API. We have defined all the details that we had, right? The right side, we can see that the documentation is also created based on the details that we have given in the editor. Here it's a get flights API. We have a query parameters from, destination, date and class, and the header parameter detail. And also we can see the details for the success response, the media type, and also the response example. Let's click on try. The mock services, we can test the API by using the mock service. Let's click on send. We will get the success response. This works based on the mock data that we have given in the example. So whatever we have defined as an example are reflecting here. If we don't give something which is mandatory, we get a bad request, because as per the API specification, all the fields are, we can see that the star mark, right? All the fields are mandatory. So if we don't give the field which are mandatory, we will get an error. Otherwise we get a success response, and also in the response we get what example we have defined in the response section. So what if we want to make some field optional? Here we can see that required is present for all the fields. So all the field is mandatory. So the API consumer must pass all of these, otherwise they'll get a bad request. So let's add a field which is an optional. Let's add some random field. And make it optional. The type of the field is string. Yeah, let's give some example. Yeah, by default the fields are optional, required. So what if we want to make them optional? Let's click on enter. In the next line we will get an option. Let's go. Yeah, we get the different parameters auto populated. Here we can select the required, and if we make it false, this field will not be a required field, it will be a optional field. Yeah, we can see that the random field is now the optional field. If you make it true, you can change, you can see the difference, it's required now. Yeah, this is one way of making the field optional by setting the required property to false. Yeah, there is another way where we can use the question mark in front of the field. Now by default it's required, let's use question mark. Yeah, this way, using this way also we can make the field optional. Yeah, now the random field is optional. The API consumer don't have to pass this always, it's optional. Yeah, we have enums, the departure date. Let's add some constraint for departure date as well. Since it's a string field, we can define the maximum length of the field string it accepts and the minimum length. The minimum length this field accept is 10. If we give the less string with less than 10 characters, we will get an error. We cannot give a string with more than 15 characters or less than 10 characters. Otherwise, we get an exception. Okay, we have defined the constraint for the departure date. Flight class is a enum, and we have a header, and also we have defined the success response. So we have completed the get flights API for success workflow, but we always don't get a success response. Sometimes we get negative workflows as well. We get 400, 404, so on. We get error codes as well. For example, if we don't pass the field which is mandatory, we get bad request because we are not passing the flight class which was mandatory. So let's define the details of the negative responses as well. 400 body, it will be a JSON response. The description, you can give the description you want. Then let's give the example. Let's copy the example and add it here. An API can give a different type of errors. It can be 400, 401, 404, so on. If we give invalid resource name, then it says the resource is not found, right? Because it was expecting flights, but we gave some random string, so the resource is not found. So let's define 404 as well. Okay, if we give the HTTP method which is not supported, then we get okay, sorry, let's correct the resource. Yeah, we get method not allowed. When you supply the method, HTTP method which is not supported, then we get an error saying the method is not allowed. These are kind of generic errors that we get for an API. So let's define the details. Body, we can select based on where you have placed cursor, you are getting all the populated values, just select them and give the example. And 500 is very generic, internal server error. So let's define that as well. And we can get 401 also, In case if the client gives us the invalid client ID or secret, they get an error saying access is denied because you are an invalid user. So let's give the details of 401 as well, so that the API consumer knows that what all errors they can expect. Yeah, in the documentation section we can see that the error codes are available. Success gives the flights and the error codes gives the respective error messages. 401, 404, and we have all the error details that we have specified in the editor. From the this is an interactive API console from where we can use a mock service to test the APIs. If we don't give the optional field, we still get the success response. Yes, we are getting it because it was an optional field. And we can check the constraint we have defined. If we don't pass a date with a minimum of 10 strings, it gives an error. We have described the API, the getFlights API. We have given the details of the query parameters, headers, the response, the details of the success response, and also the error responses. So we have completed the getFlight APIs. Yeah, now we can start with the post API. We should be exactly below the get method. It is under the same resource. So we don't have to add a resource again. We can just add the HTTP method because both get and post APIs are under the flights resource. Otherwise we will have to add / and then the resource name. Now it's not required. So if we go back, we don't get the HTTP method, right? We have to be exactly under the get method. Now we are getting the option. Let's select post. We can see the documentation. Select the post API, nothing is defined. This post flights API will post the flight information. Let's add the description. This API will add the flight information. Post is a HTTP method. We have a header details. We don't have query parameters, but we have headers. Let's select header. We have already defined the header details. It's same as the previous API. So let's copy the header details. Let's align it properly. Okay. Yeah, in the documentation section we can see that headers are added, and we have a request body. It's in JSON format. So let's add the request body. Let's come exactly below the headers. We will get a body option. Body is in JSON. Let's add the description. It's a flight information. Let's add an example. Yeah, select the example and copy the request body and add it as an example. Yeah, the request body is added in the documentation as well. We can see that the details of the request body. Yeah, The request body is added, header details are also added. Now we have to give the details of the response. Response 201 indicates that the resource is, the data is created. Whenever the user writes the flight information, it's a create action, so it will be a 201 to indicate that the data is created. There can be an entry created in the database, so it's 201. The response is in JSON. An entry created for flight. Let's take the example from the Postman. Yeah, the errors that we got for the get flights API will be applicable for post flights as well. Yeah, when the resource is not found, we get the 404, and if we have an invalid method, we get 405, so on. So the error codes that we have got for the get flights will be applicable for post as well. So let's copy the details, the error codes from get flights API, and use it for post as well. So now we have seen how to create a API specification, and we have created the specification for get flights and also for post flights. We have defined the details of the APIs, the query parameter, response, and other details. So now let's see, if we want to create APIs for different resource again, we can just add the resource details / and the resource name. Here let's take booking as an API again. It's a different API. So the user can just add the resource name and then the method, the HTTP methods. Here let's add get and delete. The right side in the documentation, we can see that the booking endpoints are created, the get and delete. And if we want to add the resource below the flights, inside the flights, for example, if user wants to get the booking information for flights, they can add a resource under the flights resource / booking, then booking ID is a URI parameter here. Let's add the HTTP methods, and new endpoints are created in the documentation sections. We can see that the APIs are created under flights, booking, and booking ID endpoint. Yes, we can select the parameters, header and the query parameters based on the requirements and keep on creating the APIs. So here the booking ID is the URI parameter. And let's go inside the get API and see the details of the parameter. It's a string field which is a required field. This booking ID is a URI parameter. You can pass the ID of the booking and call the API. That's URI parameter. If we want to set some constraint for this field, we can select the URI parameter, and that the shelf will show the name of the parameter, and it's identifying the name of the URI parameter because it's inside the curly parenthesis. So, and for this we can set the constraint because it's a string field. In the documentation section, we can see that it's a string field. Let's change it to number. And since it's a number, we will get an option to set the minimum and maximum value for this field, so that user should send the value for this field that should match this constraint. Let's say the minimum value it accepts is 5 and the maximum is 1000. So the consumer should call this API by giving the URI parameter, this booking ID, between 5 to 1000. Let's try to use a mock service and call this service. Here we can clearly see that the values below 5 are shown as invalid because we have a constraint set. So let's give 5 or above 5 works for this. Yeah, 4 is invalid. This is how we can set the constraints for URI parameters as well. Yes. Yeah, we have created the APIs the flights API and also the booking APIs, we have seen how to set the constraint for the URI parameters and also for query parameters as well. So based on the requirements we have, we can create the APIs. Yeah. Previously, we had seen the details of the API from the Postman for both GET and POST APIs, and the same details we have used and created the API specifications. Now the APIs are ready. Let's publish to Exchange. And when the specification is published to Exchange, let's give the asset version and API version and publish to Exchange. Once we publish the API specification to Exchange, it will be available for other developers and the clients and for stakeholders as well, so that they can review the API and give you the feedback so that you can work on the changes. If you want to add more information for API, you can do that. Let's go to Exchange. Here we can see that in the Exchange, the API portal is created where the consumer can understand more about the APIs that we have created. We had seen the details from Postman. The details were not in human readable format. User was not able to understand the constraints from the Postman, right? So here from the API portal, they can go to the particular APIs. For example, let's go to the GET flights, where we can see the details of each field, about the limitation of the field or the constraint set. They can see the resource and the method details. And if we have any optional fields, like here the random field is an optional field, so user can pass it or they can neglect the field. And also they can see the response detail, what response they get when they call the API. And also it's an interactive console. The user can use the mock service and test the API. It's a mock service, and the values that we are seeing for each of these fields are from API specification examples. What we have given in the examples are reflecting here. If we change the value for the date, we can see that it's a invalid because it accepts a string with a minimum of length 10 characters. Let's hit send. We can see that we are getting a success response. The response details are based on the data that we have given. Yeah, if we don't give the fields which are mandatory, we will get bad request. So using the mock service, we can test the APIs. And also we had set the constraint for the URI parameter, and that also can be seen clearly. What field it is and what data it accepts and all the information. This way we have created the API specifications where the consumer can understand the API better. And we can use the same API from Anypoint Studio as well, and we can use this for application development. Yeah, the error codes and the success response, all the details are available so that people can review and give you the feedback about the API. Yeah, now the details of the APIs are in human readable format. That's API specification. Thank you. See you in next session.